Welcome back to The Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, and of course, The Futurist is the #1 futurist podcast on the planet. And this week, we're delighted to have a guest who has deep technology experience, is involved in many ventures in the technology space, has run many technology companies of his own, and is investing heavily in next generation technologies. So when we look at trying to forecast the future and what's happening, he's an excellent guest to have this conversation with. Fabrice Grinda, welcome to The Futurists.
Thank you for having me.
So I know, one of the big moments, defining moments in your life in technology you talk about is getting your first PC in 1984. I will tell you, I could tell you right now, in 84, I had an IBM XT that my dad had got me, and I was delighted to get my first hard disk, which was an amazing, a massive 40 megabyte hard disk, replacing the twin floppy disk drives that I had on the PC. And I thought, I am never in my life going to fill this thing up with space. So I guess you can appreciate the irony of that.
I felt the same way. I had an 8088 Intel. It was a compact with a CGA graphic card, 4 colors, a 360K 525-inch floppy, 20 mega hard drive, 1200 baud modem, and a 9.9 dot matrix printer. And same thing, the 20 megs of hard drive space felt infinite.
Yeah. Well, there's that famous Bill Gates quote, 640K ought to be enough for anybody. And here we are today talking about these massive GPU chips and, for, of course, the NVIDIA chips and things like that, which that all sort of pales into insignificance. But you started out, obviously, in France in Nice. You're in the Turks and Caicos right now?
I'm currently in the Turks and Caicos.
Okay, so you spend your time between New York, Turks and Caicos, and British Columbia, right?
Absolutely.
But let's get into your early career, and then when you knew that because you're a technologist, but you're also a futurologist or a futurist in that you apply these super forecasting methods to these various technologies that you're an early stage investor in. You've had obviously significant success in the venture space as an angel investor, and then now with your own funds. But when was it that you sort of first found yourself interested in being a futurist, and when did that align with your technology journey?
Came very early. I mean, honestly, when I got my first PC in 84, it was like love at first click. I immediately knew we were meant to be together. Somehow the freedom I had in programming and building computers resonated with me. And so my heroes back in the day were Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. But to your point, and they were founders, which is why it kind of led me to want to live the American dream and leave France at the tender age of 17 to go to Princeton. I went to Princeton knowing I wanted to be a tech founder. I'm not sure I would describe myself as a futurologist just then yet, because the reason I became a tech founder is not because I was like, I was 10, remember, based on analysis of future trends, clearly this will be a $1 trillion industry in the future, and therefore this is what I should be focusing on. No, it was my hobby. It just so happens that my hobby became a $1 trillion industry, and all of a sudden I was at the right time, the right place for the right skills. But that said, going into college, I knew I wanted to be a tech founder. In terms of a futurologist, I think it comes more from curiosity. My entire life, I think one of the defining traits is curiosity of the world, so the history, our world history, and where we're heading, and of presence. And this is intellectual. This curiosity is not just about the way the world works, but also, frankly, about creativity. And so I was always fascinated by sci-fi. As a kid, in 7, 8, 9, I was Jules Verne's was probably the author I consumed the most, and I read every single Jules Verne book, which is sci-fi from the early 20th century, late 19th century, if you want, from that perspective, and fell in love with sci-fi. And all of a sudden, I found myself, as a reading an hour and a half, and I still do this to this day, every night as my bedtime routine. So I end up reading 100 plus books a year. And of these, the majority is sci-fi. And so it expands your horizon, gives you a sense of the way the future works. Now, the connection between getting a perspective of where the world is, the future is heading relative to where we are today, I think comes from multiple things. One is like studying history, B is reading sci-fi, and C is actually being a technologist myself. So being a tech founder, being an investor, a venture capitalist, I'm pitched ideas by founders who want to sell me the world of tomorrow. And so in a way, I live in people's future because
Mm.
I'm seeing today the ideas that are going to come to fruition in 3, 5, 10 years. And it gives me a sense of where we're at. And that's why for most things, I have a sense, okay, this is how much this technology costs today. It's not yet affordable. These are the deflationary curves that we're seeing. As a result, we can see the point where it's going to get to the mass market price point, and we can get mass market adoption. And this gives me a good sense of, okay, this is when, back in the day, it was like smartphones will become viable and affordable. This is when broadband becomes viable and affordable. If anything, though, living in this future, being pitched all these ideas, we have a tendency to be probably more optimistic. And so
Of course, yeah.
usually my forecasts are probably ahead of schedule relative to reality. In the late 90s, I told my dad, no, you should definitely not invest in AOL. I mean, that company is going to get killed by broadband. And the funny thing is, and it kind of was true,
Yeah.
except in the meantime, it made the massive merger with Time
Time
Warner,
Warner.
and the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
year I think that like broadband was less than the majority of revenues, like the 2010s. Same thing with Netflix. Netflix went public in 2002, and I think I told my dad saying, no, don't invest in Netflix. They're going to have to transition to VOD. Most companies don't transition well from being a content distributor to content manufacturer, and the margins are going to compress. That was actually true as well. By the first year that the video on demand became more significant than shipping DVDs was like 2012, 2013. So it took another decade. Same thing with self-driving.
Yeah.
Like one of my early worries, I invested early in Uber. One of my early worries in Uber in like maybe 2012, 13, 14 is like what's going to happen to their moat of having a critical mass of supply of drivers once all the cars are self-driving. And of course that'll happen in the next 5 years. And here we are more than a decade later, and self-driving has not yet come to the fore. So it's easy to imagine the future when you live and breathe it on a daily basis, and then you need to temper expectations relative to cultural mores, etc. And that's why I've become not a contrarian in AI in the sense that AI will transform and revolutionize the world in ways you can't even begin to fathom. More in the timing of the adoption. Right now, I think we're near the top of the hype cycle where people are thinking it's going to happen immediately, and most of GDP is government and large enterprise, and before they implement it and the culture changes to really see the benefits from productivity growth perspective, I think it's going to take 10, 20 years. Kind of like the late 90s, right?
Yeah.
Webvan, eToys,
Yeah.
Pets.com,
Yeah.
all these ideas.
Pets.com, man. I used to talk about Pets.com all the time.
But these are good ideas, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, Chewy is a $10 billion company, maybe more today. It's Pets.com.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if you remember Cosmo, right? Like that's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Postmates. And Webvan, that's Instacart. The ideas were good. It's just they were
Yeah,
ahead
they're
of their
just too
time.
early. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
too
mean,
early.
I had the same problem with moving my digital bank that I started in New York. It was just, we had 250,000 customers in 2013, and we couldn't raise a dime in
Yeah,
investment. Now, if you started a challenger bank and you had 250,000 customers, you'd raise 40 million.
absolutely.
Um, so timing is critical. I want to go back to some of your early lessons. With was it Auckland,
Auckland, yes.
your first tech company, and sort of let's sort of dive into your experience as an entrepreneur. You came out of Princeton, and that was your first startup, right?
Well, I built that company in Princeton to pay for college, but it was a sole proprietorship, like doing arbitrage between the US and Europe, selling high-end computer equipment. It's not a venture-backed, scalable company.
Right.
So then I went to McKinsey. I knew I wanted to be a tech founder, but it's like I'm 21, I'm kind of introverted and shy, and even though I built a little tech company, it's not. I want to build a larger one. I need to learn business. So McKinsey was like business school, except they pay you. And then 98, 23, I'm like, okay, tech bubble didn't pass me by. It's still going on. Let's go build my first big venture-backed company. And that was Auckland, which was an eBay type company for Europe.
Okay. You famously said on your blog, on your personal bio, about some of the lessons that you learned in those early days, in respect to choosing VCs and things like that. But tell me about your early experiences as an entrepreneur in the space, and what you learned in those, because it's compressed learning scale, obviously, but what you
Absolutely.
learned through that process.
Look, the late '90s were a fascinating time period to exist in as a young tech founder, because all of a sudden you were at the right time, at the right place, with the right skills, at a moment where humanity just seemed to value that, right? Like the number of people that knew how to build and code, etc., in tech was de minimis, and the world decided that this was a very valuable skill. And of course, that led to Jeff Bezos and Amazon and many other beautiful and amazing companies being built. And so I'm like, you know what? Let's go down this path. Obviously, this is what I've been meant to be doing, regardless of the fact that there's this exogenous bubble going on in this environment. And things learned. I deferred probably too much to my early VCs. They're like, oh, you need to bring like great hair talent, et cetera. And they didn't realize the fundamental difference in the startup environment were being quick and decisive, even if you're wrong, because then you can readjust, is better than having unanimous decision. And so I hired the wrong people, more gray-haired, experienced people. That there's some roles for which that makes sense. You're a CFO, et cetera. But for the rest, it actually was the wrong hires. Two, I picked the wrong VC. I raised them. I took the VC that offered the highest valuation and the most amount of money. But ultimately, that's a vanity metric. What matters is not
Yeah,
the
yeah.
valuation which you raise; it's the exit valuation. And the VC also didn't really understand what I was doing in the category I was in, to the point that when the time came to exit, I wanted to sell to eBay, and they said no. They instead forced me to sell to another company whose stock ultimately fell 99.98%. And I didn't understand. It was pre things like safe notes and everything was being standardized. I didn't understand most of the rights, right? Again, I was 23, so I didn't. You want the right to drag, so the right to force a sale, even when you lose control of the company as you get diluted on the way up. I didn't even know what that was, and I
Mm.
hired the wrong lawyers because I was so young. They didn't take me seriously, and so we didn't have any of the rights we were supposed to have. So it's a very expensive lesson, but in a way, it's an expensive lesson at someone else's expense, right? Like the VCs funded
Yeah.
me, and they taught me how to build correctly. And especially since in that time period, nothing mattered other than growth, right? Like unit economics didn't matter, burn didn't matter. And then all of a sudden the world flipped. And once the tech essentially depression hit in 2000, it was the opposite. There was no capital to be raised, and so but I didn't do this for the money. I did this because I like building something, and nothing like, okay, I want to be a tech founder, but now let's go build in a sound manner. Like, let's take our time. Let's focus on unit economics. Let's not burn too much. In a moment where capital basically disappeared. So my second company was basically the opposite. It was completely self-funded. Had to be profitable as soon as possible, and it was built on a shoestring. I think I missed payroll 27 times. I invested every last penny I had in it. I lived in New York on $2 a day for like 18 months, sleeping in the couch of the office. I couldn't even afford coffee. It was like ramen noodles, 4 cups a day. That was it.
I mean, so many entrepreneurs have these stories, and I think getting through that is sort of a rite of passage for entrepreneurs. Elon Musk talks famously about the dual potential failure of SpaceX and Tesla, Christmas 2008, and how, that sort of was snatched from the jaws of defeat. Richard Branson talks about those moments, often. I had a similar moment with Movin, where we closed a financing deal, a commercial deal, on Christmas Day 2016. We had 2 million in receivables, in debt rather, in creditors, and we had payroll to make the next day, for, I think it was about 180K for the payroll, and we had 2,000 in the bank, and a check for 8 million came in. So yeah, but it's those
I've been
moments
there.
that sort of, yeah. It's those moments that help you understand better how to plan out the business and things like that. You said at one point you raised $1.5 million, and you were doing that in 5 and 10,000, 10K increments. That's hard work.
It wasn't my desire. I wish someone could write me a 500K or $1 million check.
Yeah.
It's just in 2001, when you're telling people you're doing B2C telecom, when every B2C company had gone under, every telco had gone under, there was no appetite, and all the VCs that overextended themselves in 2099, etc., they had no capital. And so literally it was like fools, friends, and family funding me. Any person I ever met was like begging and groveling, and that's how I would get 5K. And that's how I'd make payroll, by the way. Like, get 10K, make payroll.
Tell me about Zingy, the business. Sorry. Tell me about Zingy, the business that you're sort of talking about.
Yeah, so Zingy was a mobile content company. It came from the realization well, first of all, it's not a business I particularly cared about, right? People tell you, oh, build something you're passionate about. But depends on the constraints you're faced with. And at that time, in 2001, the constraint was there was no capital available. I needed to be able to build something absent any capital. And this is the idea of like selling ringtones and mobile games and mobile content on old generation cell phones. The Nokia phones of back in the day, pre-iPhone and pre-smartphones. I felt, this I think I know how to execute. The idea is kind of proven because it works in Europe, it works in Asia. At some point, it will work in the US. And so it's an idea I didn't really feel an affinity for, but I felt, you know what, no one else is doing it. I think I can execute this, and that's why I went ahead and built it, because my ambition was to be a tech founder. And by the way, I thought that like the internet was dead. It's going to be this niche thing. There's not going to be any money in it, but it's okay because I didn't do this for money. I did this out of passion, and I liked this, and I found myself unemployable. I disliked vehemently the idea of working for someone else instead of doing my own thing. And it just turns out that this tiny niche little thing was not as dead as we expected it to be, and it came back. And so Zing grew from $1 million in revenues in 2002 to $5 million in 2003 to 50 in 2004 to 200 in 2005. And so this was the opposite. I grabbed victory from the jaws of defeat after missing payroll so many times, became profitable on August 15, 2003, the most meaningful moment in my business career, frankly, to date. As at that point in time, we became masters of our own destiny, and we went from strength to strength. And after that, I'm like, okay, now I've made, well, then I sold it, this time for cash, and a bit early, but better too early than too late. And I owned most of it because I hadn't raised that much money. I owned 53% of it. I sold for $80 million in cash. I was 29. Stayed on as CEO for 18 months because it was actually interesting to be part of a publicly traded company. It was interesting to be part of a rocket ship that was growing so quickly. And then I'm like, okay, now let's go build something that I care deeply and meaningfully about.
And that was that OLX? Is that what you're referring to?
So I'd studied market design. I'm an economist by formation. I went to college and I thought that economics explained the way the world worked better than most other disciplines. And I I was already a technologist, so I didn't feel like I needed to study more of that in college. And so I studied economics and mathematics, though I frankly studied everything from the Roman Empire to the Peloponnesian War to Southeast Asian studies to Mandarin to you name it. But again, pursuing intellectual curiosity. But economics was my major, and mathematics. And so I studied market design. And so marketplaces as a means of creating liquidity, transparency, and value made a lot of sense to me, which is why for my first company, when I saw the site of eBay, it was like love, again, at first click. I saw it, it was like, it resonated. I'm like, oh, you're taking these opaque, fragmented markets and making them more efficient, bringing them online, creating deeper pools of sellers and buyers, unleashing a massive wave of liquidity and value. But in a way, eBay was the wrong idea. Craigslist is a much simpler idea to execute, especially in a world where payments was not very well adopted and trusted online, where shipping was reasonably expensive. What I should have done with my first company was more the Craigslist than eBay. But then I'm like, you know what? Craigslist is becoming a public force in the US. I actually tried to convince Craig to either sell me or let me run Craigslist. Couldn't convince him of either. So I'm like, you know what? I don't think they're doing a particularly good job. they're providing a public service by being free, but they're not modernizing the UX UI. There's a lot of scams, spam, all this prostitution. It's pretty horrible, and it doesn't take into consideration the fact that most household purchases are made by women. Most core decisions in people's lives are made by women, and yet this is the least female-friendly site in the world. So let's create a safe, female-friendly version of Craigslist for the rest of the world. And that was OLX, which ultimately grew to 11,000 employees in 30 countries, the leader in most emerging markets, so like Brazil and all of Latam, India, Pakistan, all Southeast Asia, actually the Middle East, in the UAE, Dubizzle, which is the leading site in the UAE and all the Middle East, in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Russia, and all of Eastern Europe. And that company is amazing. I mean, millions of people make a living off of it every month. It is embedded in the fabric of society in these countries, where it is the place to sell an item, buy an item, find a job, find a car, find an apartment, and it is transformational and meaningful in the lives of, frankly, like 5% of the world's population. So it was definitely my crowning achievement. It's an amazing company, and it was a company I was meant to build, and it was a company I wanted to build. I'm very, very happy to have built OLX into the company it became, and still is.
Well, what we like to do just before we go to break is we like to dive into a bit of your futurist pedigree, and we call it the lightning round. So if you can keep your answers punchy and short, let's find out a little bit more about Fabrice. What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to in media?
Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, when I was like 7 or 8.
And I've been in some of the Parisian markets and seen some of the first editions. Beautiful books, like absolutely amazing. Yeah,
in red covers,
yes,
gold pages, beautiful books. I have the entire collection.
Yeah. Oh wow. What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
The problem, well, I think the obvious answer is, the problem is they're all, I think it's a not an amazing question, because they're all built on top of each other, right? Like, so if you you need fire, and then you need the wheel, and then you need the steam engine in order to get to electricity. The Industrial Revolution, of course, is what's changed humanity's quality of life the most, and it's mostly driven by the electrification of the world. So I'd say electricity, but of course it could not have existed had all the other technologies come by before. And I love where we're at today with like smartphones, for instance, where you could be a poor African farmer and you have access to all the sum totality of humanity's knowledge in your pocket. You have free global video communications, and with GPT, you have like a super smart assistant. You have more communications and information than the President of the United States did 25 years ago.
Exactly.
I think it's revolutionary and mind-boggling. But again, absent electricity, it wouldn't exist.
Yeah,
so
okay.
kind of hard to answer the question. I think all these things are amazing, and that's the beauty of technology. It's incremental. It builds on the things that we've had in the past, and it leads to transformational outcomes.
Very good. Name a futurist or an entrepreneur that's been particularly influential in your thinking and your business life.
So I'm not one of like, what is your favorite book? What is the person that has been the most thoughtful, etc. I just consume. I read. I have a lot of sources and information. So yes, I love that the Steve Pinker and Peter Diamandis types thinkers of the world on the rational optimist type side. I love, frankly, the Bill Gates perspective on, and he's spending a lot more time now being reflective, and that he's no longer running Microsoft and doing its philanthropy of like, where do you get more IR, what the future looks like. So I don't have a great answer. It's more reading a lot of books and meeting a lot of people and getting an opinion based on that. Look, I love *Sapiens* and and so reading Harari, but again, I disagree with a lot of what he writes. So I'm not sure there's one in any of these. It's more
Okay.
read a lot of sources and
Be
meet a lot of
open to
people who are
new
building
ideas.
interesting tech and like come up with your own perspective.
All right, final question. Is there a science fiction story that is most representative of the future you hope for?
The If you look at Star Trek: The Next Generation, it probably is the best future to hope for because it's like optimistic and thoughtful and makes you dream of a better tomorrow where the purpose of life and the meaning of life is to explore and to learn. We go and look at the wonders of the universe, and our purpose is to just figure out what is so wonderful out there. And so it's like looking at the world with optimism and curiosity and solving conflict through legal through articulate rational reasoning and trying to find solutions to problems. So probably that's the universe that makes the most sense from that
Yeah.
perspective. Most other things are too dystopian or bleak,
Yeah.
etc. But some of these things make for better stories. I like
David
my
Brin
favorites.
D-
Yeah.
David Brin says the reason that dystopian sci-fi movies get made is it's a lot easier to produce a dystopian sci-fi movie than it is a utopian one in terms of budget. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But
It's more entertaining, right? Like,
yeah,
why are people fascinated by negative news as opposed to optimistic news? It's like more interesting. People watch movies because there's conflict, not because it's like
yeah,
we're all singing "Kumbaya" under under
yeah.
the moonlight and telling
Who's
each
gonna
other
win?
how amazing
Yeah.
everything is.
All right, good. Well, listen, let's take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Brett King, your host. We'll be right back after these words from our kind sponsors. Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm with Fabrice Grinda. He's a technologist, a venture capitalist. In fact, Forbes called him the number one angel investor in the world. He's invested in over 1,000 companies and had 300 exits to date. Fabrice, before we were talking, obviously about some of the companies that you founded yourself that gave you your early success as an entrepreneur. But now that you're in the world of investment, obviously making future bets and forecasting which technologies are coming of age and where the opportunities are really key. Tell us about your investment methodology there, and there's a lot of companies you've invested in. How did how do you choose your winners out of those?
So first of all, I describe myself as an accidental venture capitalist or accidental investor. What happened originally is a lot of founders saw me as a publicly successful CEO, and they approached me and said, "Hey, do you want to invest?" And I thought long and hard, should I be an investor? It's a distraction from my core mandate as founder CEO. But ultimately, I'm like, if I can articulate lessons learned to others, it makes me a better founder. If I can keep my fingers on the pulse of the market by meeting other founders, it makes me a better founder. But in order to not be too distracted, I need to be able to decide very quickly if I invest or not. And so back in 98, I came up with 4 selection criteria to decide whether I invest in a startup or not. And these remain true to this day. It used to be a 1 hour meeting. Now it's 2 1 hour meetings because someone is filtering the 300 inbound deals we get per week, mostly from other investors and VCs and founders. But the 4 selection criteria are as follows. One is, do I like the founder? Like, do I think the founder is an extraordinary visionary who also has the capacity to execute? And the Venn diagram intersection of salesperson who can be eloquent and visionary and knows how to execute is actually pretty small. You're either in one or the other bucket. Number 2, do I like the business? And I mean, is the total addressable market big enough, or the unit economics attractive? And if not, is there a way to get there without all the stars and the multiverse aligning? Number 3, are the deal terms fair? Now, nothing's cheap in tech, but is it fair in light of the traction, the team, and the category? And number 4, which is the one that intersects with futurology, is what is the problem they're trying to sell to solve, and is it in line with my vision of the future of humanity? And I have very clear perspective on the future of mobility, the future of climate, the future of real estate, the future of food in various verticals, based on the curiosity and interactions I have with many other founders and just reflections on the topic. And so is it aligned? And this is where the timing comes from, because I think many people pitching me ideas that are too early in a way, right? Like the big fad in VR was like in 2013 or 14 when the Oculus came out. But actually, the best time to invest is actually not when things are released. It's actually once they're at the inflection point of having critical mass, where the best, where you have enough users, where the best practices in terms of monetization, application to build, et cetera, are defined. So let me give you an example of on smartphones. The iPhone came out in 2007. The best time to build an iOS gaming company was actually 2012. So 5 years after introduction, because by then you had over 100 million users on the platform. The best practices in terms of customer acquisition, retention, monetization, and development were established. And that's when Supercell, the gaming company that created Clash of Clans, which ultimately was sold for 10 billion, was created. And so I think about these things in terms of, that's why VR, until it was created in a way effectively with the Oculus in 2013, 2014, I haven't invested until this year, 2024. Now in VR, you have 40 million installed base, 8 million monthly actives, and with the Quest 3S from Meta, you have a $299 price point device, which is the price point at which you historically have had mass market adoption of things like consoles. And so I think now is finally the time that you reach this inflection. And so many things were too early. Augmented reality, right? Many people build even Google Glasses funds back in 2015, 2016. Of course, they all went under because Google Glasses didn't work. So AR and like the Apple Vision Pro, I suspect is very, very early. But there's a pretty profound difference between what I think is most interesting in giving a sense of the future and what is investable. Like ideas that are going to come to the fore in 10 years or not necessarily investable because the time horizons, they may be too capital intensive. You may not be able to get the subsequent rounds, and they're not going to lead to the best returns. And so things I think about from a future perspective, what's going to come is sometimes, actually maybe even often, disconnected from the things that I'm investing in today, which are more maybe incremental. It's like, oh, let's digitize B2B supply chains because in your consumer life, you have this extraordinary user experience where you can buy something at Amazon and get it in a day or two, buy something at DoorDash, get an Uber, book an Airbnb, and then you go to the business world and you have nothing. There's not even a catalog where it's available, let alone payments, shipping, tracking, connectivity to the factory to understand manufacturing capacity. It's less exciting in a way, but it's profoundly transformational because it's deflationary. And it's going to make our lives cheaper and better.
It's interesting. When I mean, there are a bunch of really cool technologies now that we need commercializing in order to address problems like climate change. For example, carbon sequestration technologies or various technologies around climate mitigation and climate resilience. But because they're seen as 10 or 20 years out, they're not getting the amount of investment required. But we need to accelerate investment in these fields so that we don't have billions of people die. So it strikes me that we are at this coming to this inflection point where growth and the return on investment may not be as strong a driver culturally or socially as it has in the past. Are you seeing a sort of a shift in thesis of investors to be more open to things that are just investing purely for good rather than for return?
So first of all, I think most people that are investing for good. The reason they're investing for return is return guarantees that you're investing in the places that are scalable. So the reason
Hmm.
I would argue that what I do I give millions to charity every year. I fund the education of 10,000 kids K through 12 in the Dominican Republic. I do a lot of non-for-profit stuff and stuff that I find it harder to address through the for-profit sector. But if I think of the impact I've had societally, my for-profit activities are actually way more scalable and way more impactful at a global scale in terms of hundreds of millions of people use my site every month. Tens of millions of people make a living off my site every month, and then through the companies I've invested in, we've touched pretty much every human on Earth in a positive deflationary way. So I like the for-profit motive because it leads to scalable solutions, and what I think is interesting is the bigger the problem, typically the bigger the opportunity. So climate is going to be $1 trillion opportunity as we address it. And so I'm actually not worried
He's probably
that
underselling it, right?
yeah, it's gonna be multi-trillion-dollar category
Yeah,
and solution. I mean, imagine you built commercial fusion that was viable. You'd be a trillionaire, right? Like, and that's
mm,
true of many of these technologies. And so I'm actually profoundly optimistic. And the capitalism works as an amazing, efficient capital allocation solution. And so, but why are people doing what they're doing? Like, I don't need more money, right? Like, I could have retired 20
right.
years ago. I do this because I think the way to solve the world's
You can make a
problems
difference.
is through tech, right? Tech is
Yeah,
deflationary and can touch billions of people. Through politics, I find it's like petty and small and corrupt, and frankly, the amount of power you ultimately have in the political processes, because it's all check and balances, is actually reasonably limited, and
unless you're
also
Elon Musk,
also limited
apparently.
by yeah, but Elon has had more impact through tech than politics
Oh
so
yeah, for
far,
sure, for sure.
right? It's
Yeah,
like
and
making
even if he
accelerating the
gets
future.
right, even if he gets some political leeway, he's still going to be making an impact through tech. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Talking about Elon sort of we this is obviously leading us to the personal robot field. You're a big investor in Figure.ai. It's it's a general purpose humanoid robot platform. And this is really interesting because we've seen humanoid robots predicted in science fiction for 60 years now, and some would argue that the reason that is because it's if you're going to depict a robot in science fiction, you had to have an actor in a suit, right? This is why robots look humanoid. But the arguments that people like Elon Musk make and so forth is that if you want to navigate a world that humans live in, a humanoid robot is a pretty good form factor for that. But tell me, how quickly you see humanoid robots being a part of society, and what is it going to look like?
Yeah. So first of all, the, the economic reason for why you want humanoid robots is pretty simple. There's tens of trillions invested in creating infrastructure for humans to work in. And so you have two solutions. You could rebuild the entire infrastructure for dedicated robots, or you build a humanoid robot. It's actually cheaper to build a humanoid robot, and both will coexist. Obviously, there are many functions where you can have dedicated robots. Um, the time frames are quicker than one can imagine. So the reason it's taken forever to get to where we are is solving the problems of humanoid robots, or you needed batteries that lasted long enough. You needed robots that be able to walk. You need to understand the world you're in terms of what are the different items that exist out
Machine
there, and
vision, image
what
recognition. Yep.
exactly you need vision, you need spatial recognition, you need also to understand, like, is this soft or squishy? I'd hold it.
Yeah.
You need like manual dexterity that's extremely complex, and you needed to be able to understand the tasks that you were asked to do. And all of these had discrete problems that needed to be solved. And little by little, all of them have essentially been addressed. And so Figure.ai, now we're at Figure 2. Figure 2 actually can walk. It can work 20 hours a day. It's already in use in a factory for BMW, replacing machinists. And it's a $90,000 a year lease, and it's replacing $250,000 of labor. So the economics for it already positive. Now that said, it's not yet ready. It's like doing a very simple task, right? It's taking something from the assembly line, moving it, putting it and putting it on somewhere else, and it's repeated that task hundreds of thousands of times in a way that it minimizes errors. It's not yet. You can't yet ask it, okay, like cook me a dinner, etc. But the interactions with the integration with OpenAI, they now understand the world they live in. With their proprietary AI, they understand how to create an interface with like how to control the robot to interact with the items, and the costs are declining rapidly. At this point, costs are probably dividing, by maybe a factor of 5, maybe 10 every 12 to 18 months. So it's an accelerated Moore's law. So when do I think we get to robot that you can spend, 50 to 100K a year that will be effective sooner than you think. I'd say 2 years for the
Mm.
first iteration of that, and maybe 4 years for the second one, which will be even cheaper and more mass market. And so we'll have millions of robots in not in the home, but definitely in the factory within 4 years. And we'll start to see the early adoption in the home in like 4 years. And a decade from
Yeah.
now, I think they'll be
In,
ubiquitous. So it's coming quicker than people can imagine.
in 2015, I wrote a book called Augmented Life in the Smart Lane. And I extrapolated that there'd be more robots than humans on the planet by 2035, looking at about 10 billion robots, which
I
includes
agree.
autonomous vehicles, humanoid robots, self-driving cars, drones, etc. Right? So, um,
Totally agree from that perspective. Yeah, I mean, self-driving, same thing. Like people, it was a massive hype cycle when it was in 2012, 13, kind of went by the wayside. People were like, kind of ignored it. And now it's getting to the point where it's actually, we're not far from being in a position to deploy at a massive scale. So um, I'd say within 10 years for sure. Yeah. So 2034, we'll have billions of robots in existence. So this will be a fundamental transformation, and by within 10 years, we'll also have mostly moved to self-driving. So we're finally getting the point where it's becoming relevant.
um, I want to talk about a couple of things before we wrap the show. I do I do want to get into the future, but with your training as an economist, um, one of the things that we just debated on one of the shows that Rob and I did a couple of weeks ago is the fact that we do have some sort of structural economic changes happening here with autonomy, with injecting industrial AI. And you've talked about supply chain automation. You're talking about robotics in the factory. We're having entire factories being designed to be humanless now. And one of the debates that we often have on the show is how this is going to impact the geopolitics of the world, with China seemingly much better placed than the US to make this transition because of their sort of systemic thinking and their investment in infrastructure. And also on a secondary basis, what's going to happen in terms of technology-based unemployment. So putting your economist training on, economist hat on, where do you think we're going to land on sort of smart economies of the future, and what role are humans going to have in the workforce moving forward?
So let's take a step back into history, right? The every technology that's been invented or created was essentially the objective is to replace human labor for the most part. Maybe the steam engine to replace horses, but whether we're talking about the automated loom, which the Luddites revolted against, from automation in the factories, all of it was to replace labor as labor became more expensive.
Tractors
And so
replacing agricultural workers. Yep, I get it.
absolutely. And it has happened, right? We went from a society that was 96% farmers in 1824, so 200 years ago. Uh, there was about half and half between farmers and factory workers 100 years ago to mostly service-based economy. So that transition fully happened. Now we create more food than ever before with like 3% of our workforce in farming. And so this trend is continuing. High labor costs is leading people to want to automate. But here's what's the funny corollary, is this automation typically leads to productivity increases, and this productivity increases actually leads to wage increases. And so historically, you've had massive job loss but it's led to actually creation of new jobs that are even higher paying. And let me take you back to 25 years ago. Let's go back to 1999. And if you and I were having this conversation in 1999, and I told you in 2024, in 25 years, the top four job categories of 1999 will have been decimated and will no longer exist. There will be no more travel agents. There will be no more bank tellers. 500 billion of retail will have gone from small business and in streets to online, decimating small commerce. And all of car manufacturing will have essentially been automated and replaced by robots. And these were the top four job categories by far. Let's now discuss the unemployment rate and the economic conditions in 2024. And everyone would have been like, oh my God, Great Depression, 25% unemployment. And yet we're 2x as rich as we are today as we were 25 years ago. So we're on a real GDP basis, on a per capita basis, and unemployment is lower. And it's easy to imagine the job losses we're going to have, right? Like truck drivers, et cetera. It's a lot harder to imagine the jobs of the future. But as an economist, all I can tell you is when productivity increases, wage increase, and humans will, and there's
Yes
always
and no.
constraints, right?
Yes and
Like
no.
even
Real wage growth has remained a sticky problem in the United States and the UK because of tax on collective bargaining the last 50 years. Productivity's most certainly increased, but wealth distribution in the form
actually
of real wage growth has not been
actually
as
productivity
progressive.
increases. No, productivity increases and wage increases are almost one for one. So it's actually been a decrease in productivity that has led to a slowdown in wage growth in the last 25 years. But the two have increased exactly the same amount. Now, I think both are probably underestimated because when something goes free, or if computers get cheaper, it's counted as a decrease in GDP, even though they got cheaper and faster and better. So I don't think GDP is necessarily the best metric these days with the deflationary power of tech for quality of life and productivity improvements. And same thing with things in terms of is wage the correct metric if things are getting cheaper. And of course, only the things that have been touched by tech have gotten cheaper, right? Things that are not touched by tech, like real estate or public services or healthcare, at least so far, have gotten much more expensive. But I'm hoping that that will change. So the first of all, imagine we're in a world where you have AGI and the computer is better than you at everything. It actually doesn't mean you don't have a job because there's always a constrained resource, which is going to be compute power, energy, or something, and you're going to use it for what it's most efficient at, right? Like you may be typing faster. It's required in economic theory, right? Like you may type faster than your secretary, but it's better for you to be building tech companies and running a podcast than to be typing and being
Sure.
your own assistant. And so the same thing will happen here. We'll all find amazing jobs, and if in fact the thing that gives me hope is when I look at the jobs that have been replaced historically that I suspect will be released in the future, they're jobs that humans are not meant to be doing. We're not meant to be doing this like 1,000 times over, or carrying packages, or frankly sitting in a car and driving 8 hours a day, where we're it's bad for our back, it's bad for our health. We're going to fall asleep at the wheel. We get distracted. Um, Things where we are going to use your emotional intelligence and compassion, et cetera, are going to come to the fore. I mean, imagine the role of the doctor today. The doctor today in the modern America treats you like you're a number, and he
A
spends as
commodity.
little time as possible with you.
Yeah.
So he's a diagnosticking machine. He diagnoses you, moves on to the next patient, no empathy, doesn't follow through, et cetera. But ultimately, an AI is going to be much better at that. They will look at every
Yeah.
micron of your MRI. They will have read every single research document
If you go into a
possible.
doctor's surgery in 5 years' time into a clinic and the doctor doesn't have
Yeah,
AI, you'll be going, I'm out of here.
yeah. But so the doctor's role, if the AI does the diagnosticing, the doctor will actually be the one with a good bedside manner, making sure you understand the diagnostic, making sure you follow through the treatment. And so it's going to completely change the relationship. The doctor is going to be a human again. It's going to be someone who's going to be nice and kind and take the time and make sure you understand, etc. It's going to be way better. Same thing with education.
I
Like,
wonder. I mean, I've never been in residency, obviously, as a doctor, but it would appear to me that bedside manner, which will be the core skill, because you'll pass diagnostics off to AI, is something that just isn't trained for in medical, courses these days. So that's going to have to
it's going to
change.
have to change.
It's the emotional quotient, right? Is where the
Absolutely.
human connection comes. All right, so let's get to 2050. You know, describe for me some of the macro changes you see happening in the world, and what makes you optimistic about that future that we're heading towards.
2050, the basically because of the deflationary power of solar and batteries, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, will have completely transitioned our energy production to solar and batteries. there's a small probability of fusion, but I'd say even without fusion, it doesn't matter. And so our energy production will basically be fully emission free. Well, it'll essentially have all switched over to solar and batteries, and the marginal cost of electricity as a result will be near zero. Where the marginal cost of electricity near zero, and that's despite massive increases in demand for energy consumption by AI, because energy production will be near zero, a lot of the constraints that people worry about will go away. So we're going to have infinite fresh water because we can desalinate basically the ocean. We have 70% of the world is water. We are going to be able to have infinite food because you're going to have vertical farms. You can actually grow crops in the desert when you have infinite free fresh water, basically. And so we're going to live in a world of abundance from both an energy and food and water perspective, which will improve people's quality of life massively. All the cars on the road will be electric and powered obviously by a zero emission energy grid, and will be self-driving. We'll have drone deliveries for many items, or actually automated deliveries, which means the marginal cost of delivery will go to zero, which means the way we interact with the world will be fundamentally different. I can imagine a world where it'll be so much cheaper to basically order food and have it delivered in a few minutes. It'll be amazing and fresh, so that most people probably won't even have kitchens in their homes because you're going to have, without even including the opportunity cost of your time, you won't need to go grocery shopping. You're going to have amazing food of every infinite variety delivered to your home in 15 minutes for cheaper than it would cost for you to make it. And the humanoid robots will be common. You most likely will have humanoid robot helping you. It'll be not just for the rich, but frankly for everyone. It'll help with childcare and taking care of the dog and helping with household chores, to the point that I think number of hours worked per week will continue declining. We're currently at 39 hours per week in the West, and number of days of vacation will keep improving. And what will people do with that free time is actually one of the great challenges of the 21st century. Historically, our jobs have been a source of meaning and purpose, and we're going to have to find purpose outside of that. And of course, that's, I think, part of the reason we're going to have a mental health crisis, where people are going to not know how to define and create difference in their lives, and which has partly led to the opioid crisis, but there's many other reasons for it. And yes, you may be stuck playing video games, but that's okay. But many people will actually find.
I like Dave Shapiro's view of he talks about the meaning and purpose economy. He says, in 20 years' time, when I ask you what you do, the job you do is not what you get paid for, because that will essentially be a function of society in terms of, you won't need money to survive, your housing costs, your electricity, etc. So what you're left with is what you really care about, and
exactly. You will do things that give you purpose, personal purpose and joy. And humans love social hierarchies. You will find something you love to do, and you will do that, whatever that may be, and that'll be amazing. So I sidebar because people were pessimistic about, like, oh, if you have this infinite free time where you can use it for, and yes, some people will waste it, but I think many people will find joy in painting and singing and traveling the world and learning new sports and languages, etc. I'm so optimistic.
Rebuilding the world from climate chaos, like
absolutely.
That's pretty purposeful.
Absolutely.
All right, so Fabrice, listen, it's been great having. Yeah, no, it's been great having you on the show. Let me ask you this as we wrap. Tell me, how do people find out what you're doing on the investment side? With the funds you're working on, and generally, where can they follow what you're doing? I know you're a digital nomad. You live around the world, but how can people keep track of Fabrice?
The easiest way is I have a blog called, which is just my name, fabricegrinda.com. I've created a digital avatar, Fabrice AI, and you can interact with Fabrice AI, and it's actually pretty good in terms of understanding what our theses are, what we do, etc. You can check out my fund website. It's fjlabs.com, and you can follow me on LinkedIn, probably the 3 best ways to follow me in general.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your time. It's fascinating to hear from someone on the cusp of investment in new technologies that you are ultimately optimistic about these things. And certainly, we really appreciate your insights today.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's it for the Futurists this week. A shout out to Kevin Hersham, our engineer, our producer Lisbeth Severance, and the team at Provoke that help us produce the show every week. If you want to hear from a guest on the show, if you want us to interview someone, let us know on social or hit us up and tell us what topics you'd like to get into as well. And don't forget to stay tuned for the Futurist event that's coming next year in April in Dubai. We'll tell you more about that as the dates draw closer. But thank you for listening to the Futurists again this week. Until next week, we'll see you in the future.